moving on to our final session for the afternoon. And in this panel, we're looking at another key issue, one that we mentioned briefly before, another one that, of course, is increasingly at the forefront of the mind of investors. And that's following the Juukan Gorge disaster, highlighted really as starkly as possible the need to focus on working together with First Nations communities. And we know the Yukon Gorge, the destruction of 46,000 years, culturally significant rock shelters in the Pilbara, and it was a devastating loss. And even more devastating, it wasn't a unique event. There's been poor engagement between companies and First Peoples that's damaged communities and cultural heritage and countries. And as investors are increasingly realising, and as we talked about earlier, it also represents material investment risk. So this session will look at how companies can build genuine, long-term and constructive relationships with traditional owners. So joining you this afternoon is Professor Marcia Langton, the Foundation Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne, Jamie Lowe, Chief Executive Officer of the National Native Title Council, Joe Morrison, Chief Executive Officer of the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation, and Cara Keys, Director of Seabus Super and Chair of Women in Super. And just a reminder, the full bios are on the conference web. And a very big virtual welcome to our panel this afternoon. Again, sorry that we can't all be there in person, and it's wonderful that you've joined us from your various parts of this country. If I can start by looking back, Professor Langton, if I can start with you, to what extent was the Juukan Gorge destruction representative of a much bigger issue?
It is highly representative of the problem with our cultural heritage legislation, and more particularly with the disregard that corporations have for the traditional owners that they are parties with in Indigenous land use agreements. So the Yukon Gorge destruction occurred even though Rio Tinto iron ore was in a contractual arrangement under an Indigenous land use agreement with the PKKP traditional owners. That Indigenous land use agreement was struck under the Native Title Act, and as many would know, these agreements are registered in the federal court, so they're binding. But the problem is in the implementation of the agreement, the company was, I think, negligent in its responsibilities. Now, this became public little bit by little bit as the company representatives gave evidence to the inquiry, the parliamentary inquiry. And whereas they started out with a mealy-mouthed apology, after several iterations of both oral evidence and written submissions, eventually they had to start fessing up, and it became evident, and the parliamentary inquiry in its interim report said as much, that they knew what they were doing, they knew they were destroying an important site, and they did it anyway because technically they thought they could get away with it. So it boggles the mind that a company like Rio Tinto, that some years ago had an outstanding reputation for its negotiation of Indigenous land use agreements, would simply trash that reputation altogether in order to mine one site, which I think had the value of about $130 million. So their global reputation has gone down the tubes for the sake of one small deposit. And I think the whole thing reeks of, contempt for the traditional owners, really. The interim report is pretty clear about that.
Joe, can I ask you what your experience is and what the conditions on the ground are that allow this to happen? Because we talk about the Rio Tinto experience, but then, in an entirely different industry, we can look at Woolworths and the proposed Dan Murphy's in Darwin, which they, the company has now admitted that they didn't listen to the feedback. But that's another extraordinary example, isn't it, of just simply not engaging, not listening.
Yeah, I think it highlights a number of things that Professor Langton has touched on, and one is the native title system in which these things operate, particularly in the mining sector, and the exclusivity in relation to the nature of those agreements. And I think at the end of the day that there's a very distant understanding that traditional owners have in relation to the some agreements and what is understood by the company. But I think in the cases of Dan Murphy's in Darwin, the Northern Territory government, I think, played a very strong role in that as well. It wasn't just the corporation; it was also the environment in which Dan Murphy's were invited into, knowing that up the road from the proposed development was an Aboriginal community that had been and continues to suffer disadvantage at all levels, and so there's a real disconnect between, I think, corporations and their obligations and legal agreements, but also corporate social responsibilities and the role of the public sector in this space as well. So I think there's a long way to go in relation to dealing with how corporations and governments interact with Indigenous people.
Jamie, do you agree with that? It's a confluence of everything from poor or non-existent legislative protection, poor governance, poor practice. It's sort of everything that comes together for such a negative outcome.
Yeah, I think, Professor Langton and Joe have pretty nailed in regard to, that environment which we're operating in. Unfortunately for our people, it's not a new thing. It's something that we've known for 250 odd years now, since colonisation of our people, the oppression and the trauma that our people have faced. And now we know that when, you use Juukan Gorge as an example, the Woolworths at, next door to the Bagot community in Darwin, other examples of where our people don't have a seat at the table, where the decision makers are, whether that be in government or within the big corporates. And when our voices are being spoken, we aren't listened to. And so I think that's a major issue. We know that laws create a pathway for destruction or other things to oppress our people. So decision makers need to be Aboriginal people in regard to Aboriginal places, etc. as well.
Cara, Jamie just talked about not being listened to. I wonder how you see the impact of the destruction of the Yukon Gorge and whether not ever a game changer you would want, but that it has actually been a turning point.
Absolutely. Look, as a First Nations woman and an Australian, the destruction of that cultural heritage in Western Australia was just devastating. It's everybody's history. It's everybody's culture. It belongs to the First Nations people, but it's our entire country's story. So that is absolutely devastating. From an investor point of view, we saw very, very keenly the material investment risk of corporate behaviour. And obviously, therefore, the long-term effects on our members and what we're trying to achieve for our members, which is good long-term investments with returns, so they have a retirement in dignity. I think the other thing, and I think to that point, in terms of it being a game changer, this is sort of like where we were with the climate debate, say 20 years ago. We didn't really understand, and we were just starting on the journey and the pathway to understand what the material risk of climate change and the destruction of the environment would mean on our investments and our member investments. And in terms of what happened with Rio, what I've heard directly from the ground, if I can give an example of material risk, is that things like that have a direct impact on the potential damage to their pipeline of work. Because from a community perspective, and not just communities in Western Australia, but all across Australia where there is extractive industries, there's a contagion effect where people become very, very nervous about engagement with these big corporations and therefore can potentially materially affect the pipeline of extractive work, which we know, therefore materially affects the investment. The secondary comment that I would make on that, and just to sort of connect this back to the financial sector industry, is that one of the big takeouts of the CBA review was that boards have to consider, and investments have to consider, non-material risk as a source of potential material risk, but also non-material risks, particularly with regard to culture. And what we know from this situation with Rio Tinto, there was a complete failure of culture at the executive level and at the board level. I think, as Professor Langton pointed out in what she first said, they went from hero to zero. They went from best in show to worst in show. They used to have the best reputation, and they did it, mindfully. They did what they did mindfully. So I think from an investment point of view, obviously the material risk is absolutely the critical lens that we are putting on. There's a consideration of the non-material risk as well. But, we do have to think about, from an investor point of view, our engagement strategy, both with First Nations people, but also with companies. How do we engage in an effective way so that we are protecting the materiality of our investment? But what is important in that conversation, which is where we're sort of 20 years behind in terms of climate, is effective engagement with First Nations people.
Professor Langton, do you agree that we're where we were 20 years ago with climate? And to what extent is this now an issue globally for investors? It's not limited just to Australia.
Yes, I do agree with Cara. I think that's a very important point to make. We did, we as in the native title sector, people involved in Aboriginal cultural heritage, in assisting companies to negotiate with Indigenous people. We did a lot of work from the time of the promulgation of the Native Title Act to over a period of 20 years to make sure that industry understood that there were ways of working with Indigenous people that led to a good result for all parties, hence the Indigenous land use agreements. But we've been let down by corporate culture, which in the worst cases, as in the Rio Tinto iron ore case, assigns those agreements to the shelf, to a kind of tick box attitude. We've done that, we don't have to worry about it anymore. Whereas in fact, the purpose of the agreements is an ongoing relationship throughout the life of the project to ensure that the best practice is sustained throughout the life of the project. Where we see these spectacular failures is where those arrangements have been disregarded. Now, what this leads to is that companies think that obtaining an Indigenous land use agreement with Indigenous Australians is sufficient to retain their social licence to operate. It is not sufficient, and investors should be mindful of whether or not the terms of these agreements are being adhered to. If there's a cultural heritage management plan, and in the best cases there are there regular meetings between the company personnel and the traditional owners? If not, why not? And that was a glaring absence in the Juukan Gorge scenario. The Rio Tinto simply did not sustain that relationship. They didn't even know who the members, off the record, I can say, they didn't even know who the present members of the executive of the prescribed body corporate or native title corporation was. They didn't know the chairman's name. They didn't have his phone number. And, I don't think they really cared. They really thought that it was just a tick box exercise. Having negotiated it, they could just put it aside and get on with business. And 2016 marks a real change in culture. So you'll remember that we negotiated those Indigenous land use agreements during a global mining boom. When the boom subsided and prices went down, there was a scramble to make money, and anything Indigenous is seen as costing money. and you know, that was a mistake, a very, very bad mistake, because now ignoring the agreement has cost them their reputation and their social license to operate. And this is what Cara is talking about.
And Professor Langton,
now invest in Rio Tinto.
Well, can I ask you that? I mean, you've got an audience of investors here. Do you think investors now, you just made the point, you've got to ask the questions, you know, are the appropriate plans in place? Are they being adhered to? Are they being followed? You know, are they surviving year beyond year? All those things. Do you think investors now know what to ask and are alert to the issues in a way that they haven't been before?
I think they've got an inkling of what the problems might be, but it's a complicated area and they need to educate themselves about these issues and really pay attention to the detail, which is why organisations like the National Native Title Council, of which Jamie is the chair, are so important. Because, you know, the government does not play a role in regulating these relationships. These relationships are not regulated by government. It's really up to Indigenous people to take companies to court. And if they don't, then we see standards slide. And it would be such a shame after all these years of hard work to go back to the old culture of, you know, litigation, whereas, you know, we set up a culture of negotiation and settlement through agreements. And now, you know, that's all being put at risk. And I think, you know, everybody wants a stable business environment. Most of all, Indigenous people who desperately want to be in the supply chain of those industries that are operating on their land, be it, you know, the resource industry or tourism, because these are the best economic opportunities for Indigenous people, who are the poorest people in Australia, especially in the areas where resource industries operate. So it's in everybody's interest to get this right, and we need to help you to get on top of the detail.
Well, Jamie, to that point, and from the perspective of First Nations peoples, how do they see the role of the investor, and how is the view about the role of the investor changing?
Well, I think we've got an opportunity now as an education piece that needs to take place. I think Professor Langton spout that out. There's an inkling there. There's a fair bit of work to be done because it is a complicated area. We heard this morning from Catherine Livingston from CBA around kind of the environmental issues. We kind of know the what because there's been 20 years of research, you know, talking about the what, and now we get on to the how and the when. I think we are at the moment in the relationship that we're forming with the investment sector, we're educating the investment sector about the what. Because I think Professor Langton also said that it's been a self-regulated environment to date, and I think there needs to be more scrutiny put on. I know, you know, Steve Brax talked about the scrutiny and more regulation. Well, this is the area that actually needs more regulation within it because, you know, you get incidents like Juukan Gorge happening. So I think to investigate the what, I think it's critical. Relationships like with the people that you have on mind today are critical. But also, I think from a leadership perspective in these major companies, we know that until, you know, a couple of months ago when Ben White was appointed as a board member on Rio Tinto, there was 0 First Nations people from Australia sitting on ASX listed companies in the world. So that's a pretty big stat, isn't it? We also heard this morning around the skills matrix on boards, yeah? So if there's no First Nations people sitting on boards, and we're speaking about a skills matrix and the board being understand the risk of kind of their relationships and potential disasters such as Juukan and affecting their bottom line, if they haven't got the skills to actually kind of ask the right questions, they literally can't ask the right questions. So I think from the First Nations leadership, I think these major companies need to think about that, and the investment industry, I reckon, can play a critical role in elevating that conversation.
Jamie, that actually ties in very nicely with a question I got here from Chris Newsham, which I'll actually put to Joe. But Chris is saying, you mentioned First Peoples, yet there's a diversity of views based on region, clan, etc. And unfortunately, this division's been used to extract agreements. How can investors from 3,500 kilometres away determine what voice to listen to? And I imagine that that question is one that a number of investors would ask. Is it a fair question?
I think it is, and it's not a new question, of course, but I think that ultimately many of these places, whether it's in the extractive industry or not, have got some form of native title determination or interest overlaid it. And so it's pretty clear through that process that the people that you need to deal with, those either have got a determination of native title or have got a pending claim before the federal court. So I think speaking to representative bodies and ensuring they're involved, obviously some of them in fact have got legislative responsibilities in relation to negotiating these land use agreements. So it's pretty clear. I think the old argument though, in my experience of saying that Indigenous people aren't organised and there's intra-tribal disputes and those sorts of things is a pretty old argument that I think most of us have heard, but it's not an excuse to find out what the real channels are and to explore those channels in the same way that you get a lot of noise when you're dealing with non-Indigenous interests. That noise is always obviously evident in Indigenous circles as well, but it cannot be used as an excuse to distract away from getting real work done.
Well, but on that point, Joe, I wonder, do we need more, and I'll get to the issue of legislative protections in a minute, but do we need more specific guidelines, better standards for companies to benchmark themselves against that investors can then also use to benchmark the companies, looking at things, all the sorts of things that have been identified, access to information, getting consent, not just seeking it, power imbalances. Do we need more specific guidelines for benchmarking that would help investors make those assessments?
I think what all of us have said so far on this panel is exactly that we need more guidelines to be informed through a good partnership with Indigenous peoples, and we also need the regulatory environment to be up to standard as well. I mean, we've obviously seen in many places around the world that where Indigenous peoples have struggled with industry, there's opportunities for new relationships to form, particularly with the investor community. Australia's not unique. I mean, this stuff has been playing out in North America and Canada and other places for some time, and I think there's some lessons to be learned from that. But I would think and hope that Australia would also want to be an international leader as well. When we're just talking about Juukan Gorge, that's obviously a stain on our history, and there's now an opportunity to reset the relationship and to get these things in place so we can, in fact, as Indigenous people, be part of nation building, not just a stakeholder to be consulted with.
Kara, I know that we've been talking about it, but I've got a question here. Given the destruction of the Juukan Gorge had material impacts for our investments, what can investors do to avoid this happening again? And I would have thought the incentive should be more than just the material impacts. It should be what we've lost as a nation. But in a very simple way, investors who do sit there and think, I'm thousands of miles away, I don't have an insight into this, what do you recommend investors do?
I think some of the panel members and Kara's outlined that, and she can jump in again. I mean, obviously ensuring that investors are aware of what needs to be put into place. And if I was an investor, I'd certainly be asking those questions as to what is getting done and what are the guidelines and how can I benchmark the company that I want to put my investments into to ensure that they're doing the right thing when it comes to Indigenous cultural heritage.
Kara?
Look, I would agree 100% with what Joe said, but there is an incredible amount of work on foot through ACSI. The work that the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors is doing in this space is leading the country. They are looking to do a large piece around investor guidelines, around expectations, around what are those questions that you should be asking as an investor. I mean, collectively as investors, we hold, a good stake in a lot of these sort of global extractive companies. And I think as the last session was talking about, it is hard sometimes when you're sitting there as an institutional investor, 3,500 kilometres away and no educational understanding. This is why we have ACSI, because we can save money and collectivise the education piece through important organisations like ACSI, And they have really picked up the baton and said, okay, we need to do this as our own organisation, but do this for our members and the investor community. And I think that's really, really important, is that don't feel like you're alone within your investment team, or if you're on an investment committee, don't feel like there's nowhere to go to. If you need a first port of call to actually understand the dynamics of what's happening and get some advice, they would probably say, go to Jamie. He will help you understand who the PBC is you need to talk to, but there is a first port of call, and that has been deliberately set up because there has been so much investor concern and agitation around what has happened in Western Australia. It's devastating. We sort of were talking about earlier on. It is devastating that it's happened, but gosh, it is a bit of a silver lining that it has put a bit of a fire under the investor community to understand that we need to take these things seriously. And then the global work, and Joe, I know you spoke about this as well, the global work that has been happening, because there has been global agitation and interest in what is happening here in Australia, does really set us up for both domestic and global leadership in this space. But I know that I know that we can't always think about these things in terms of materiality, but as a trustee, that's my sole purpose and I have to. But this is the sort of serious situation where, the kind of moral and ethical outrage actually intersects with the sole purpose test in terms of materiality for our members.
And just to give a bit of context, I said I would return to the legislative framework if we like. Jamie, the legislative protections are clearly woeful. Where are we up to with proposed changes, particularly in WA, to legislative protections?
Well, in WA, unfortunately, there's a fair way down the track of creating new laws there, but they're very similar to the old laws, which is a major issue. So we've been lobbying government, the industry and others for them to invite and have Aboriginal people in the room when they're actually crafting that legislation, rather than just going out and talking to a couple of black fellows going back and doing their thing, which is definitely the old way of doing business. And that creates an issue. We know that the WA government are hoping to introduce that legislation to the Parliament in the coming months, and every traditional owner that I've talked to over there is extremely concerned, and they'll be kind of ramping up their activism in regard to that. I guess the thing that the investors can do is that we can further educate them, and we've had outside briefing sessions in regard to the inadequacies of the current draft bill. And, we invite that kind of education piece further if investors want to find out more about that and put their support behind that. Because I guess the law is actually generally the backstop, as a benchmark to be able to protect sites, because we know that Juukan was actually within the laws within WA. We know that WA isn't unique legislation. We know that other jurisdictions have got very similar types of legislation and sections within their so-called Heritage Protection Act, which don't actually protect heritage, are actually more permits to destroy heritage. We know that. And then it kind of cascades down to Kara's point, that actually then presents huge moral and ethical risk to the investors and their license to operate. So that's the cascading down effect. So even though it's within the law, there's still a moral and ethical issue when these sites have been destroyed. So we know that with Juukan, just some kind of figures out there, we know that over the past 12 months, and it was in their annual report, Rio Tinto, they had to leave an estimated $7 billion worth of iron ore in the ground. So you just do the math on that quickly. Like, they tried to access $130 million worth of iron ore, and now they've had to leave $7 billion in the ground. Of course, their stock price didn't go down, but it didn't go up either. So there's all this analysis that actually needs to take place. We're talking about the bottom line, and I think Kara's turned the sole investor, etc. Your responsibility. There's a responsibility there for investors to be educated about this and actually then support the law to protect their investment.
Jamie, can I just ask you in relation to the legislative protection and the proposed changes, which do not include, and the government says will not include, a power of veto. Do you want to see a power of veto? Traditional
owners want to. So if if they say don't destroy our heritage, they want to be able to say, yeah, if you've got a piece of heritage on your country that should be protected under native title law and also cultural heritage law, if they say don't blow it up, you should be able to say don't blow it up. So if we want to call it a veto, we can call it a veto. But even within mining agreements, under the ILUAs, that generally happens. The mob says, don't go over there, that's a sacred site of ours, and the mining company says, okay, we won't go over there. Effectively a veto, yeah? So I think that the scare tactics around the kind of term veto can be quite vexed, and people think, oh yeah, we introduced the term veto, that means no mining. It actually doesn't mean that. It means don't destroy our heritage. Mine over there, but don't mine over here. So I think they're really two different things. The mobs aren't saying don't mine on our country, they're saying don't destroy our heritage.
Sorry, Joe, did you just want to pipe in there? No, you're right. Cara, can I ask you, I've got a question here. Now that Rio's gone from hero to zero, who are the corporate leaders in this area from the panel's perspective? That's a good question. Who's doing it right?
I think it's a really, I'm going to defer. I'll give my opinion, but I will defer to the other three panelists, to Professor Langton and Joe and Jamie, because they're much more like on the coal face of this in terms of me. But someone has asked me this question before, and to be honest, my response is always, you never know, because they all go from hero to zero very quickly, any given project. Like, because it's, there's other things to consider as well. Like, in terms of their ILUAs, are they actually, are they actually doing the employment that they said? Are they doing the land restoration that they said? In terms of labour and occupational health and safety, are they good corporate citizens? Are they treating their workers correctly? They could be heroes and zeros in one particular project based on the issue that you're talking about. So, but I'll defer to the others, I think.
Well, let me ask Professor Langton, is there a corporate that you would point to that's getting it right? Oh, Professor Langton, you're on mute.
Sorry. It's very difficult to answer that question in the absence of transparency about these arrangements. I've been arguing for years, based on a research project that I was involved in for over 10 years, that most of the substance of these Indigenous land use agreements needs to be made public. Now, not the financial arrangements, not the sacred site information, but the normal contractual terms about cultural heritage protection, environmental protection, because, for instance, one of the things that we found out during the Juukan Gorge inquiry was that many of these agreements have gag clauses. So what the lawyers have done, the lawyers for the mining companies, is slip in a gag clause which prevents the traditional owners from ever saying anything about the arrangements that they've made and anything that happens on the mine site or the project site where the agreement applies. So how can we know when there are gag clauses? Now, my recommendation to the inquiry was that we need a review of ILUAs, of all the Indigenous land use agreements, and we need the cooperation of industry to do that. There should be a thorough review of the arrangements in Indigenous land use agreements. Now, I suspect, and I'm pretty sure I'm right, that there are clauses that have been slipped into these agreements that are just downright illegal, or at a minimum, breach human rights. Who do they think they are, taking away the right of traditional owners? So they're saying to traditional owners, well, if you want native title payments, you have to keep your mouth shut for the next 30 years, and you can have no say whatsoever in public about your cultural heritage. This is why it took so long for the PKKP to appear in public. It wasn't just the COVID-19 restrictions, it was because of these gag clauses, and the interim report of the parliamentary inquiry has something to say about that. So in the absence of transparency, it's a very difficult question to answer. So Joe, this is where investors have a role.
Absolutely. I mean, Joe, I know that you'd agree that this is where investors have a role and can call for greater transparency. But do you think we do need not just that transparency, but a complete review of all the agreements that we have? Because without everything being on the table, there is no way of making a judgment, is there?
Yeah, no, I agree with Professor Langton that there needs to be a review and greater transparency for sure. And, you know, in my experience of negotiating some of these agreements in the Northern Territory, you know, there are substantial issues and challenges faced there, intergenerational challenges, because some of these projects are around for a long time. And when you have senior Indigenous people negotiating those agreements and over a 20 or 30 year period, that leadership in the community changes, you know, there's not a level of what we would call corporate knowledge through the Aboriginal community that goes to the negotiation of it. So there needs to be a better way in which there's transparency with the people who are making decisions now, but also the people who will be responsible and future decision makers in the next 20 or 30 years as well. So it just can't be seen in the snapshot of what we're dealing with now, but also deal with future generations of Indigenous people being inclusive of that process as well.
Jamie, can I ask you, this is a question from the audience, so given the historic reliance on poor protections within existing laws, how do we shift from this legal backstop approach to best practice cultural heritage protection becoming the norm? And that would be the ideal, wouldn't it? Is it the behaviour doesn't need the legislative backup?
Well, I think it's almost a values-based conversation. It's not only the legal question, as pointed out in your question. I think what happened in Juukan was that went through a number of hands, and the knowledge of that site being destroyed, it would have been, you know, dozens, if not hundreds of people actually knew that was going to happen. So I'm sure they breached their actual protocols and principles within Rio Tinto, but it's more the people that are handling it, yeah? So Australia, I think Cara in her lead there, that this is Australia's heritage and Australia needs to value it. And that's a pretty big bust to turn around because it's historical. There's 250 years of history here that we need to be spoken about. And to get Australia up to speed and actually valuing First Nations heritage as their own heritage is a big thing. And there can be some leadership in regard to that, I think, particularly from the corporate sector and also the investment sector. Even just getting back to one of your points before around who's kind of the industry lead on this, I'd say that mantle's, you know, the podium is vacant at the moment. And so I'd put the challenge out there to the corporates to actually kind of step up and put their neck out and see that they can do better. We know that even Collingwood Footy Club are actually putting themselves out there saying how they can do better. It's actually the name of the report that with the racism report that they're doing. So I reckon it's a good catch cry. How can we do better as a nation as far as our relationships with First Nations people? And in this regard, protecting our heritage, which is so valuable and it's been around, you know, in this case for 46,000 years.
So, Joe, in terms of best practice, what can we learn from what Rio Tinto has done in response to this catastrophe?
I think the first thing really is that you can't rely on legislation, as Jamie and others have pointed out, to be the backstop. And so there's got to be a shift in the psyche, I think, and this is where the investors are playing a very critical role, that entering into agreements is not the end of the game, but it's the start of a relationship, and it's got to be a long-term relationship. And so we can't rely on the laws. We've got a very challenging situation in our nation's parliament with respect to reviewing various pieces of legislation that are open to state and other politics. And so this is where I think corporate Australia could in fact stand up, as Jamie has outlined, and others, to make a change themselves and put their own necks on the block. Because at the end of the day, if we rely on nations and parliaments to provide the level of leadership we require as a nation, then I think we're going to be seeing a lot more Yukon Gorge outcomes.
Joe, though, just in terms of what Rio's done, I mean, they've reviewed over 1,000 sites, as we heard earlier. They've removed tons of iron ore, they've doubled their number of Indigenous managers, they've increased training. Do you think they get it?
Well, again, pointing again to the matters that Professor Langton pointed out, and noting that I also had a relationship with Rio Tinto and a particular time when Paul Wan was leading their Indigenous relations programs, that, you know, perhaps there's a bit of deja vu right now for Rio Tinto. And so what we don't want to see is the ebb and flow of the excitement within these companies to do something right. there's got to be a shift in the companies, in the investors, and that whole environment that sustains beyond reacting to events like Juukan Gorge.
We've only got 2 or 3 minutes left, so I just want to finish. Yeah, sorry, go, Cara, because I will actually, I'll put the question to you and then you can respond as well. I just wanted to finish by asking whether you're optimistic that at least we're on a path. Cara?
I am optimistic, actually, and I think, you know, if I was to make a final comment, I would like it to sort of really break it down for the audience today, for trustees like me or directors, you know, the institutional investor community. We know what best practice looks like, right? We know what good frameworks and expectations and standards look like. You know, under the leadership of ACSI and under our collective leadership, we know what best practice looks like in terms of gender and boards. Yeah, we know what best practice looks like in terms of REM and boards and how we have expectations around that. We know what best practice looks like on climate. Now, there's no legislative regimes around what best practice is in terms of gender diversity on boards, but we still do it because we know how positive and purposeful and impactful that is, both for companies but also for the benefits of our members. You know, we are now looking at what best practice is in terms of modern slavery. We have a legislative framework, but we know what we need to do as investors. So if we sort of break it down and demystify that we are dealing in a very, very complex space that people aren't very used to dealing in, what we can be reassured as a community is that we do know what best practice looks like, and we know what applying that to the materiality, to the benefit of our members looks like. Now what we need to do is proactively work together around what is the standards in First Nations engagement? What are the standards for corporations in terms of their engagement and practices with First Nations people and cultural heritage? And I am positive because I truly believe that as we work collectively, as we have done on these other issues, then we are going to get it right. We won't always get it right. We might fail sometimes. We'll work with our international community, investor community as well. But I am optimistic. I think as a community and as a collective, we're gonna work on this, and we're gonna get it right.
We only have about a minute, so Professor Langton, are you in the camp of Cara? Are you optimistic that we will get it right? Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
Sorry, with a lot of hard work and good faith dealings. You know, I'm pleased to see Ben Wyatt appointed to the board of both Rio Tinto and Woodside. But that by itself is not sufficient to fix this problem. It actually comes down to making the relationships between the companies and the traditional owners work. Now, I take the point that, you know, people in corporations look at the disputes going on in the Aboriginal world and throw their hands in the air. But be assured that there are people in our world who live in this climate of you know, disputation between clan groups and so on. And nevertheless, we have hundreds of Indigenous land use agreements. They're settled. The terms are well understood. They're protected by law. And just because Aboriginal people, unlike the rest of humanity, have squabbles, doesn't mean that companies are relieved of their duties to follow the Australian laws, and that includes the Native Title Act and the duty to speak to native title corporations.
Jamie, optimistic?
I think my line is that being a First Nations person and working in native title, sometimes all you have is optimism. That's my general throwaway line. So yes, optimism is always front and center for me. Of course, at any given time, you kind of feel a bit kind of dejected and whatnot, but we soldier on. So the right people in the game, there's definitely optimism there.
And Joe, Jamie's right, isn't he? If you haven't got optimism, what have you got?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, you know, from my experience working with Indigenous people and the environment, where now there's great recognition for Indigenous skills and knowledge and connection in relation to managing Australia's important environment, you know, the same thing could be done on this space too. So I think the maturing of the nation is before us, and I think these are really critical steps in that process.
Well, a big thank you to our panel, to Professor Langton, to Jo, to Jamie and to Cara. It's been a wonderful conversation, and as you said, we've got real momentum now. So let's hope that your optimism can be rewarded. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.